Hey everybody, it's Theo Vaughn here, and I got a question. When it comes to soda, are you really picking a zero sugar cola that you actually prefer, or are you just settling for what you've always had? That's the question. And I'll say this, when it comes to taste, I find that nothing beats Pepsi Zero Sugar. But you don't just have to take my word for it. That would be ridiculous. Pepsi has been doing blind taste tests for years. No labels, no brand names, just taste. And last year, they brought back the Pepsi Challenge, and the results were clear. 66% of people agreed and said that Pepsi Zero Sugar tastes better than Coca-Cola Zero Sugar. In fact, Pepsi Zero Sugar won in every market they tested. So if you're grabbing a zero sugar soda, go with the one people keep choosing when taste is the only thing that matters. Go out and try Pepsi Zero Sugar today. Let your taste decide.
Back in the 1950s, we didn't have Uber, Deliveroo, none of these companies that allows for people to get paid for by the gig, and essentially, trading job security and amenities for choosing their own business hours and creating their own business. What we had was traveling door-to-door salesmen, people who had a tie, a cheap suit, a briefcase full of brochures and samples of the items they were peddling. Goods varied from vacuum cleaners, makeup, photography, stockings, to even washing machines, though washing machine salesmen rarely went around with samples. Traveling salesmen moved around the country and were paid by commission, so they were known to get obnoxiously insistent. In autumn 1945, just 2 miles outside of Fayetteville, West Virginia, an insurance guy called Rosser Long got a stern no to a life insurance sale attempt. A father of 10, George Sodder was simply not interested. Despite the disinterest, Long was an insurance agent on a specific mission. See, a local businessman, Fiorenzo Giannutullo, had personally told him to make sure the insurance of this particular homeowner was upgraded. Giannutullo had co-signed the loan with which the house was purchased some 10 years earlier. Any payout for the already existing insurance would go to Giannutullo, which was a condition for the loan. Now, despite his best efforts, however, and to his dismay, Rosser Long failed to make the sale. Fiorenzo Giannutullo would not be happy. The reason why we know what a random insurance sales guy was up to in the mid-1900s is because of everything that happened to and around George Sodder and his family, and it would all come under extreme scrutiny due to the highly contentious events that followed just a few months later. See, it was Christmas Eve 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Snow was falling and the wind chill was a-cuttin'. A close-knit Italian family was preparing for Christmas. The Second World War had only concluded a few months earlier, and the Sodder family celebrated not only Christmas, but the safe return of 2 of their sons from the front. Unfortunately, one of the young men, Joseph, who went by Joe, he hadn't managed to get home for Christmas. He was still stationed in North Carolina, waiting to get his release papers. But the survival of him and his older brother, John, it was a joy nonetheless. The family had decided to forego the Christmas tree to honor the unwillingly absent Joe, but Christmas lights were hung to decorate the house and the gifts were wrapped, waiting to be opened. The family had 7 children aged 16 years or younger, so there was, as you can imagine, there was plenty of excitement in the air. And of course, a grand Italian feast was prepared for the celebrations, and belts, they're going to be a few buckles looser the next day. The Americanized patriarch of the family had turned his back on his country and his culture of origin to the point that he demanded the family only spoke English in the home, but some things, they never change. Italian food, it's a constant.
Gabagool, over here.
Christmas Eve, it had been a work day. Sons John, 22, the returning soldier, and George Jr., aged 16, who went by Ted, had been helping with the family business. Daddy George Sodder, he ran a trucking company from his home, and he owned 5 trucks. Himself, Ted, and John had been doing deliveries for local companies up until the early evening. Mary Ann, the oldest daughter, she worked at a dollar store, which back in those days was called a dime store, if you can believe such a thing. She returned home from work at around 6 p.m. The day had been busy, as the store, it was a popular location to purchase last-minute Christmas gifts and decorations. Sure, Mary Ann, she had bought her siblings gifts from the store, her very own self. Now, Daddy George and Mama Jenny Sodder were quite deservedly knackered. They were bollocksed. They turned in for the night at around 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve, with the youngest of the family in their bed, Sylvia, who was only 3 years old. Her crib was in her parents' bedroom. Before they did so, however, the younger boys, Maurice, who was 14, and Louis, who was 9, along with the girls Martha, 12, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, petitioned their parents to stay up just a little longer to enjoy the eve. It was customary in the family to be allowed one gift to be opened on Christmas Eve each, and all the children were excitedly playing with their new trinkets. Mary Ann, the oldest daughter, she was equally tired, but promised to stay up and watch the kids, a task that would end up with her napping on the living room couch, while the kids played on the living room floor. The radio played Christmas carols, and reports of Santa Claus sightings elated the kids. The fire crackled in the stove. John and Ted retired to the boys' bedroom upstairs at around 11:30 p.m. Now, let me just go real quick through the layout of the 8-room house. It is sort of relevant to later events to know who was where, or at least where everybody should have been if the night had progressed routinely. Spoiler alert, folks, it's not going to quite progress routinely. Now, the children's bedrooms were in the upstairs of the 2-story home. One room for girls, one for boys, each on one side of the landing. The landing, it was basically just the width of the door, right? And the rooms, they were extremely cramped. They had barely enough room for the friggin' beds. At the front of the house, on the first floor, were Jenny and George's bedroom, parents' bedroom. And then there was a living room leading to the front porch. In the middle of the first floor was a storage room and stairs leading up to the second floor. And in the back of the house, there was the office, there was a dining room, there was a kitchen leading to the back porch. The boys' room, it was on top of the dining room in the back, and the girls' room was on top of the living room in the front of the house. The house, it also had a basement where George and Ted did the old truck repairs. Now, the office had recently installed a phone line. Oh, Jesus, this is 1945, folks, so look at you. Along with a fuse box that was also recently updated and inspected by a licensed electrician. The kitchen, it had a wood-burning stove, and there was also a wood-burning heater stove in the living room. Then this night happened. Jenny Sodder woke up to a telephone ringing in the office. This was at 12:30 a.m. Mrs. Sodder, she answered the phone, and a woman on the other end of the line requested a person that didn't live in the Sodder residence. So Mrs. Sodder said, "Listen, bitch, you got the wrong number," and she received an apologies. Just as she was about to replace the receiver, however, the call got even more peculiar. Mrs. Sodder could hear laughter in the background, as if it had been a prank call made by a drunken group of early Christmas partiers. Mrs. Sodder, she hung up the phone, thought nothing of it. She returned from the office to the bedroom, and as she did so, she glanced at the shape of Mary Ann in a deep sleep on the couch in an otherwise empty living room. Now, the logical assumption Mrs. Sodder came to was that the children had all retreated to their bedchambers and left Mary Ann to sleep, since she so clearly needed the rest. The chores, however, remained undone, which frustrated Mrs. Sodder. Jenny Sodder, that was the last thing Mama Jenny said as she was going to bed. Just make sure you do the chores before you go to sleep. They ain't done no chores. Then Jenny Sodder made a decision she would come to regret for the rest of her life. Despite occasionally having done so previously, in a situation where one or more of the children had shirked their assigned tasks, Jenny decided to not go upstairs and wake them to finish the undone chores. Instead, she said, "Here, listen, I'll do them myself." She closed the curtains, she locked the doors, and she also checked on the stoves. Only remnants of hot ashes remained in the living room stove. Others had burnt out completely. She did not, however, go outside to tend to the outdoor chores with the animals. Now, more importantly, remember, she had walked through the living room, only her oldest daughter was asleep on the couch. She assumed her other kids had gone to bed, but she didn't check, she didn't go to wake them. Leaving the lights on in the living room in case Mary Ann woke up and decided to go upstairs to her own bed, she went back to her own bedroom and she fell back to sleep. Then, at about 1 a.m., so 30 minutes later, Jenny Sodder was roused from her sleep again to another loud sound. This originated from outside the house, as if something was thrown onto the roof. After listening for a while and not hearing anything further, Jenny settled back to sleep. Then another moment passed, and this time, Jenny was alerted by something quite a bit more concerning. She smelled smoke. After trying to wake her husband George up, she exited the bedroom and found the hallway heavily shrouded in smoke. Panic rising, she ran towards the stairs and found a sheet of flames devouring the corner of the office around the area of the telephone line. She tried to lift the phone receiver, but it was too hot to the touch. "The house is on fire! Wake up and get out!" Jenny yelled at the top of her lungs as the flames built momentum and billowing smoke covered more and more space of the house. Marianne, she woke up in the still lit living room on the couch. Alerted by her mother's screams, she immediately went to her parents' bedroom, picked young Sylvia up from the crib, and ran outside. Now, Jenny noticed her husband George still hadn't woken up, so she tried to rouse him again. Now, once up, George leapt into action. Assuming the fire was still small and controllable, barefoot, he ran outside to fetch the rainwater barrels in the backyard. But he found them frozen solid, as I guess water has a tendency to do in sub-zero temperatures. Meanwhile, Jenny was calling to her children at the bottom of the stairs. John and Ted appeared as silhouettes in the growing amount of smoke, and they hurried downstairs, yelling for their younger siblings to follow them. While descending, they were still of the mindset that they could help their dad put the fire out. But as the fire singed their hair and burnt their hands and ears, they realized they would not be returning upstairs. They'd only just escaped themselves in the nick of time. The spread of the fire was explosive. As the family gathered outside, it was clear there was missing members of the Sodder clan. In attempts to reach the second-story window to the bedrooms, it was noticed that a ladder that was regularly resting against the outer wall of the house was mysteriously missing, and it would later be found like 20 meters away. None of the family members had left that ladder so far away. But realizing this, desperation took over George, and he tried to climb to the bedroom window by the gutters to rescue his children, who he believed were still inside their bedroom. He cut his arm in the process horrifically, and he was frantic, believing that his children were dying in the flames. A house, it's ablaze, and a father entirely off his hinges due to sheer animalistic panic, and he was bleeding profusely from a gaping wound on his arm, desperately clawing at the drain pipes, trying to scale the burning building to reach his beloved children. Definitely no question old Georgie boy, he liked his kids, a little bit, I would say. John, the other son, he was also trying to reach the second floor using their trucks to give them a boost up, but the trucks refused to start, likely due to the freezing temperatures. Meanwhile, oldest daughter Marianne, she ran to the neighbor's house to call the authorities and the fire department. The neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Garfield, they tried to get through to the fire department, but there was no one on at the switchboard to relay their call. While the Sodder house was ablaze, farmer Thomas E. Smith was driving past on his way home. Seeing the fire, he immediately went on to search for a phone, but he only found one out of order at a nearby pub. The patrons at that pub, they left then upon hearing this to watch the fire. A group of gawkers were already gathering at the scene, some trying to help the Sodders, some just speechless from the devastating power of the fire. And some were loitering and even making a nuisance of themselves. Outside the Sodder house, there was this guy named Lonnie Johnson, who, for some reason, himself and his pal Dave Adkins, while the fire was still burning, they decided that the best course of action was to start stealing George's tools and chain hoists that he had stored in the garage for, his trucking company. In his merry state, he ended up being caught red-handed by George himself. This led to his arrest and a fine later on. But come on. One time maybe you don't want to start robbing somebody is while their house is literally on fire. That's being just a big bitch there, Lonnie. Now, the fire had burned intensely for about 45 minutes, after which the Sodder house was almost completely leveled to the ground, and 5 of the Sodder children had not been rescued. Maurice, 14 years old, Martha, 12 years old, Louis, 9, Betty, 8, Jenny, 5. All were missing. How could this happen? And was it an accident? In 1899, 46 years earlier, one Daddy Giorgio Sodder was born on the island of Sardinia. Now, Giorgio came to the USA in 1911, arriving in New York. He and his older brother Leo had left the Italian kingdom for reasons that can only be speculated, but come on folks, let's be honest, probably none of them good. Italy wasn't providing means to earn a living, and the working class at that time was literally starving. Giorgio's family, along with many, many others, suffered great deprivation and instability. Now, his brother, Leo, did return to Italy shortly after arriving in America, likely due to missing his girlfriend and his country, in which order one can only guess. Interestingly now, about 50% of Italian immigrants who came to the USA, they did actually all return to Italy at some point. Once they had earned and saved enough money, the motherland, it called them back. But our boy Giorgio, he stayed, and eventually naturalized. He never talked about his childhood years in Sardinia, nor even really his early years in the USA. Now, records showed that Giorgio worked in Pennsylvania and Michigan railroads, carrying water and tools for the workers. And in 1917, he was listed in Michigan as a plumber's assistant, and was sending money back to his parents and family in Sardinia. He registered for selective service for the First World War even. That meant basically he was in a pool to be drafted, should the need arise. The 1920s saw him starting his coal miner era in West Virginia, and I'm sure I don't need to stress how tough and dangerous, jeez boy, the life of an early 1900s miner was. But despite working hard, long hours down in the pit during the day, sure didn't he still go out and drive a taxi cab to earn an extra few bucks at night? When did you sleep, George? Like, seriously. On February 10th, 1923, Giorgio, he applied to become a naturalized citizen, having lived and toiled on US soil for over a decade. And that is when Giorgio Sodder, he officially adopted the name, the more English-sounding name of George Sodder, signing his Italian last name, Sodder, for the last time in his naturalization application. And at the time of his filing, George had already met and married a woman called Jenny Loressa Cipriani. Jenny was the second oldest child in a brood of 6 to her parents Giuseppe and Martina. The family, which was then only Jenny, her parents and her older brother, they took up and left their home in Foggia, Italy, in search of a better life in the USA in 1904, when Jenny was only 2 years of age. George and Jenny had 5 children by the time they moved to Fayetteville in 1935. Now, mining requires workers to move around often to follow the work. And basically fucking sick and tired of all this constant uprooting of the family, George craved for something more stable. He took a job in a hauling company, and the family put down roots in Fayetteville. Jenny was the sole owner of the house. What with George forgetting to actually finish that whole naturalization process. For some reason, even by the time of 1945, when the main story takes place, George still hadn't finished the goddamn application. It's like, what are you doing, George, for fuck's sake? By the time the family faced tragedy in 1945, a few things had happened. The Sodders had 5 more children, bringing the size of their brood up to 10 in total. Jenny, she was hardcore for sure. George had taken a loan from Gianotullo Company. Remember, you might remember old Gianotullo. And he had taken a loan from them as he worked for them, with the house as collateral. The company would be the beneficiary of the homeowner's insurance policy in case something happened to the house. And, you might be wondering, that's why good old Fiorenzo Gianotullo wanted their insurance policy updated. So they might get even more money should something happen to the house. Now, George Sodder was known as a straight shooter who was honest to the core, but to a point it sort of frustrated some people of opposing values and opinions. George, he gave no shit, like 0 shits about being unpopular for standing up though for what he believed in. We can only speculate on the real reason why George left the Gianotullo company, but it's not outside the realm of possibilities that 2 strong personalities, they didn't see eye to eye, and things just came to a breaking point. And it's equally as possible that George just wanted to start his own business, which, I mean, he sorta did. George and Jenny, they bought a failing trucking company, and with their sons and Jenny's accounting, they managed to turn the failing company into a thriving one. Money was good enough for them to fashion their own little repair shop in the basement of the house, where they could perform maintenance on their trucks more affordably than taking them to an auto shop. And George appreciated his freedom to earn his living above all else, and his politics reflected that. Back in Italy, you had old Benito Mussolini and his fascism. George wasn't keen on it, because in George's mind, that was a threat to freedom. And this was a dividing topic among the Italian community at that time. Some Italian Americans were in the same camp as George, others though figured, yeah, sure, Mussolini, sure he ain't so bad. And as you can imagine, there was some conflict and some harsh emotions and heated arguments among Italian Americans around this time. Even within family units, and, I mean, hey, America and Italy, they're about to go to war, so there you go. George was not a fan favorite among the Fayetteville circles for his anti-Mussolini statements. He even received threats, according to George's family members. One possible source of these threats was an organization called SOIA, Sons of Italy in America. Soia was founded on the principle of supporting the Italian government, including Mussolini's politics. Peculiarly, a system of life insurance policies was another cornerstone of Soia. It was based on the idea that Italian families were supported even if a breadwinner perished. Mutualism was also another of the base values of the Soia community. Basically, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. This type of enforced mutualism evolved and eventually became known as, checks notes, the Mafia. You might have heard of them.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
But what any of this means to a house fire in Fayetteville on Christmas Day morning 1945, we don't know for sure. But what we do know for sure is that Soia and pro-Mussolini rhetoric, it was present in Fayetteville at the time of the fire. Two things that George Sodder was very much against, to the point he had received threats about it. Oh, also, he still owed money for buying that house to his previous employer, Fiorenzo Gianotullo. And Fiorenzo Gianotullo had, a couple months earlier sent an insurance salesman to his house to get them to try and re-up and upgrade their insurance policies. Interesting. So, back to the bleak Christmas morning, 1945. The sun was rising and shedding light on the tragic sight. Remnants of a house, now a pile of ash and soot, collapsed onto itself. Acrid smells and smoke lingered in that Christmas Day air. The devastation was complete. Moments ago, a happy family unit was celebrating Christmas. Now, almost half of the family was gone. Their house was destroyed, their livelihood and futures uncertain. And of course, gawkers flocked the Sodder yard, whispering and gasping to one another about the tragedy on this day of all days. Someone who was not there, though, was the fire chief of Fayetteville, Forrest Judson Morris. Let's just rewind a bit and ask why. While the fire was still raging that very early Christmas morning, farmer Thomas E. Smith, remember who had driven by and had already tried to get a phone call through to the fire department earlier, he finally managed to get Fire Chief Morris on the line. Now, Farmer Smith, having failed to make contact at the watering hole, took the initiative to travel the whole 2 miles to Fayetteville, where his call was successfully placed and he eventually reached Fire Chief Morris. Morris's response to Smith's report of a fire taking place at that very moment was, "We know about the fire." Huh? How? Now, Smith understandably became frustrated at the nonchalant, attitude Morris was presenting. Smith told Morris there were children still trapped inside the burning building. And to this, Fire Chief Morris didn't even have a response. Which is weird because, it's kind of like, isn't it like your fucking job to kind of have a response to this? Sickened by this response he was getting, basically, Farmer Smith hung up and went back to the Sodder house. He could probably do more himself. But by the time he got there, the fire had already burned through most of the building. Farmer Thomas E. Smith went home and once again returned at dawn to see if he could help out. I can only imagine the absolute rage and dejection he felt when he got there the following morning. Fucking firefighters still hadn't arrived. At 9 a.m. on Christmas Day, Morris and his firefighters finally got to the scene, over 7 hours after the fire had already consumed the house. He was immediately chastised and questioned over his tardiness, and this put him in a bit of a mood. He was a bit stroppy that morning. Chief Morris started to oversee the extinguishing of the last remaining embers of the house, and to begin the initial search. Townsfolk and people who had gathered at the house were the main searchers. I mean, the firefighters were fucking useless. And remember, they were expecting to find the bodies of 5 children. With little to no instructions or any kind of organization, the neighbors went through the rubble and ashes, recovering a few bits and bobs. Partly burned household items could be recovered, but no remains were found. There was no sign of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Betty, or Jenny. Now, the search itself took about an hour, after which Fire Chief Morris went to inform George that remains couldn't be located. He claimed he did do a thorough search himself, but would reveal years later he mainly just poked around the area where the bedrooms were supposed to have been. And remember, this was, a 2-story house that was now completely flat, and basically was like, sure, I'll go to the front part of this flat square, and nothing there. Another job well done. George now, as you can imagine, found it hard to accept that there were no remains of his 5 children, and he became pretty frustrated when the fire chief suggested, literally this is what he said, should just scoop up a box full of ash and bury that.
What the fuck is this piece of shit?
Only after receiving the news that the place had been searched was George allowing himself even to be taken to the hospital. He had to get his arm stitched up and get treated for severe shock, resulting from the extensive blood loss and the shock of losing his children. Jenny and the surviving children would go to live with family members. Now, Fire Marshal Carlisle Alonzo Raper arrived on location on December 26th to conduct a criminal investigation. He had been investigating arson cases for 15 years. What was the cause of the Sodder fire? And Fire Marshal, he was not pleased at the state of the scene and the amateur searchers mucking about the area. It was an utter dismay to him to find the trampled, botched site. He's reported to have said, "There's no way we can identify arson or any other cause in this, simply because of the state that it was in." Due to the contamination, he was unable to conduct a reliable investigation and had to turn in an unfinished report. But he hoped to interview the Sodder family after they had recovered from the shock to go through what they knew of the fire. The official coroner's inquest was held on December 26th, and the 5 missing children, were all issued death certificates, citing asphyxiation as the cause of the death and the fire accidental. They didn't have bodies for the 5 children. They just assumed that they must have just burnt up somewhere in there. George, he filled the basement in with dirt, believing the ashy pit was nothing but a grave for his children, and he could not bear to look at it day by day and not feel extreme distress. This act would also end up complicating things in ways he didn't understand at the time, but because he was under the impression that the investigation was concluded and nothing more could be done at the site, the Sodder family, they initially accepted the authorities' assessment, despite so many things feeling off. George knew the wiring in the house, it should have been up to code. It was redone and inspected just a couple of months earlier. Furthermore, George and Jenny both knew the lights in the house had been on when they woke up to the fire. Jenny, remember, she had left the lights on for her daughter Mary Ann, who was asleep on the sofa. All of the surviving Sodder family members reported that the lights being on helped them find their way out of the smoke. The origin of the fire couldn't have been electric. It wasn't a fuse box or anything, but it being electric was basically what the authorities were saying. Jenny's suspicions were inflamed further when another house fire with 7 victims happened nearby. All 7 skeletons were recovered intact. The Sodders, they began to realize there were way too many discrepancies that the offered explanation that may not be the case, and their fight for a proper investigation would go on for decades. A year and a half after the fire, in the summer of 1947, the Sodders hired Oscar Tinsley, the first of what would become many private investigators. Tinsley was like your typical 1950s PI, Raymond Chandler type. He had a trench coat and a trilby hat. And they also started to inquire about a possible excavation of the scene, of the fire site. It was at this point that Reverend James Frame informed the Sodders about a discovery Chief Morris claimed to have made on the morning of the fire. Morris was going around town saying that he had found remains in the rubble and buried them back in the site on the same day. Now, this might come as a shock to you, but it definitely came as a shock to the Sodders, who were appalled. This was news to them. How had they not been informed about remains found on the day of the fire? They still, had no clue what had happened to their kids. Moreover, Morris was claiming that he had found a human heart, preserved and unaffected by the fire. Now, the Sodders, they then entered into a state of trying to strong-arm Fire Chief Morris to basically explain, what the fuck are you talking about? They eventually managed to get some kind of story out of the Fire Chief. According to him, after everyone had left the burned house on Christmas Day, he looked around some more and happened to just sort of come across a heart that was not burnt and surrounded by nothing else, just there. He claimed he put it in a box and buried it in the dirt and then left it there, and told nobody about this for about a year, and then started telling everybody, this nice little bar story. George and P.I. Tinsley made Morris show exactly where he had buried the heart, and they dug the box up, and there was actually a box there. They took it to a funeral home in Montgomery, a town overs away, where the box was opened and the contents examined, and a portion of it was sent to a lab for further testing. But even with a naked eye, the funeral home staff could tell that's not a heart. First off, anybody could tell you that that's not a heart. It's a liver. And the lab results ended up confirming it wasn't even a human liver. It was a cow's liver. Moreover, the piece of offal was remarkably well preserved for something that had been buried for a year and a half. And it definitely didn't show any signs of being in a fire. However, the box and the mass of meat inside, it started to immediately decay, and due to the smell, it was placed outside of the funeral home. Consequently, the box and its contents disappeared. Now, the box was likely mistakenly taken by garbage collectors doing rounds, and nothing too suspicious happened thereafter, but it's still unfortunate that yet another piece of evidence was lost, because that story makes absolutely no sense at all. Fire Chief Morris, when he was asked, why hadn't you told anybody about, finding, a cow's liver? He said he never told anybody because he wasn't asked. So there you go. In 1949, it was decided that the site should be dug up and a thorough excavation conducted to locate the remains of the children. The excavation started on the morning of August 18th, 1949, and something was found. Bones. In 2 locations on the opposing sides of the house, deep in the corners of the basement. Now, one of the finds was quickly identified as of animal origin, but the other find on the opposite side of the house, it was 4 pieces of vertebrae, and it came from a human. Now, that was the extent of the discoveries made in the excavation, and the vertebrae, they were sent in for further analysis. And this is when it takes a weird turn yet again, like finding a cow's liver, right? Pathologists at the Smithsonian Institute received the bones the vertebrae found and indicated that they came from an older male than Louis or Maurice, who were the 2 missing boys. They estimated that the age of the bones found around 16 to 22. Maurice, the oldest missing kid, was 14. The bones did not show any sign of charred or being in a fire, and the absence of other bones in their vicinity made them conclude the bones were insignificant to the case. One suggested source for these bones is the dirt that George Sodder used to fill in the remains of the house. Which, is that just me? Or is that really fucking weird that there's just bones and dirt around the place? No? Normal? Okay. So, what actually happened to the Sodder house? Well, electrical fire is obviously a possibility. Things supporting this view is the location Jenny described seeing flames in, the office where the fuse box and the telephone lines were. An electrical fire in the 1940s doesn't really require, a whole lot of explanation, which is why investigators jumped to file the case as such to begin with. Back in the 40s, electrical safety was simply just not that reliable back then. In addition, the house had just been fitted with a new electric heater, so it's possible that lines were damaged during the renovation. Now, there was, remember, a reliable inspector, an electrician, who was said to have okayed the new electrics, replaced them, and given, a thorough look over, but sometimes these things can just happen. A freak accident, right? But something that strongly works against the faulty wiring starting a fire theory is that everybody said the lights were still on in the house. Onlookers reported the Christmas lights fashioned onto the house, outside the house, they were on. The family said they were only able to escape the house because the lights were on. If it was an electrical fire, it would have immediately cut all of the electricity inside the house if it was a fuse box or something. And the one massive thing working against the accident theory is the unanswered question. Where are the children or their remains? The fire, it was simply not hot enough to burn through human bone. It is much more likely that the remains just weren't located. That they were in the fire, they just have never been found. But that also requires a hefty amount of suspending our disbelief. Everything we know about the multiple searches tells us they should have been found. If they were there, they should have been found. So therefore, they were not there. There has to be just the tiniest chance, unluckiest of circumstances, that maybe the children, blinded by smoke in their confused, panicked state, ran into some confined space in the furthest corner and piled up in there until they all died together, and that little nook where the kids ran into was somehow missed. But the bottom line is that if we are to believe the accident theory, we also have to believe the search was so utterly botched that the bones were still there, entombed in this ruin of a house. Which, in fairness now, judging by how the fire chief acted, not that surprising. In his initial statements, John Sodder claimed, remember, who had just returned from serving in the military, he said that after waking up to his mother's screams about the fire, he grabbed one of his younger brothers by the shoulders, trying to shake him awake. Now, this would be proof that the children, or at least one of the children, was inside the house. That they were inside the house, but they were all fast asleep by the time of the fire starting. What's interesting about that is John later retracted his statement, saying he didn't touch one of the now missing kids, like moments before he fled the house. He revised this and told investigators he only yelled at his siblings to wake up. He didn't see nor touch any of them. He just assumed they were there, and he didn't hear any of them respond to him either as he was leaving the house. And both surviving boys reported they had no recollection of the younger boys coming up to the room during the night. I mean, the last thing we know about the missing kids is that they were all playing downstairs in the living room, their sister was sleeping on the couch right beside them, and then they were gone. You know, the mom comes down then later on and she sees them not in the living room, she assumes they've gone to bed, but nobody can say they did go to bed. So where were they? For bone to burn into ash, it takes a tremendous amount of heat and a long ass time. Neither of those were present at the house. Multiple witness accounts stated that the house burned down and collapsed in about 30 to 45 minutes. And while wood is excellent fuel, it does not provide high enough heat to burn true bones. It takes about 5 hours to burn bones into ashes in crematoriums or whatever. And even then, when they do that, there are still some bone fragments left behind that have to be ground down. But what if an accelerant was present at the house to raise the temperature to a high enough level? Tires stashed in the basement, oil, coal, stuff like that. None of those existed in the house in the quantity that would be sufficient. Another theory suggests the fire burned in the basement under the rubble and created a sort of oven. So even when the house collapsed, the fire was still going on in the basement, which would decimate bones like in a professional, crematorium. But this also doesn't really work. When the fire brigade finally arrived, the remnants of the house were cold enough for them to walk on, and the remaining embers were easily extinguished with what was essentially a garden hose. Had it been an oven burning bones through the night, that wouldn't have been possible. It still would have been way too hot to step onto. Basically, if the children died in the fire, there would have been remains left. Over 1,000 bones in total. It's almost inconceivable that not a single frickin' bone was found. So was it arson? That's possible. With resentment burning high and politics under contention, it's not outside the scope of possibilities that somebody deliberately set fire to the house, especially if you buy into the mafia activity at the time. Remember, after the phone call, Jenny woke up once again. She heard a noise on the roof, which could be a firebomb or a Molotov cocktail being thrown onto the roof of the house. Jenny says it was like something was rolling on the roof and rattling into the gutter. Another piece of evidence backing up that theory is a statement of a bus driver driving past the Sodder house right around this time. He described seeing multiple ball-like objects, fireballs, he said, being rolled onto the roof of the house. Was that due to John O'Toole's life insurance policy? Remember, he insisted the life insurance policy be upgraded before the house was burned. That's a little bit suspicione, I'm thinking. Speculating, maybe John O'Toole may have been quite miffed at George. He had loaned George the money for the house, but George was dissing his BFF, Mussolini, and so he decided to show him what's what. Realizing he can fuck George over and earn a bit of money, he sent the insurance agent to try and convince George to increase the payout in the case of a fire. But George didn't go for it. George didn't upgrade the insurance, so who knows? If George had increased it, maybe he would have burned the house down, but he didn't. Now, Fiorenzo Gianotto's vindictive wrath was clear in a statement he allegedly directed at George Sodder after he turned down the insurance agent. He's quoted to have said, "I see you have refused to take out insurance and refused to sign the papers to settle Mrs. Sodder's family estate. Your goddamn house is going to go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. Also, you're going to be paid back for the dirty remarks you have made about Mussolini." Damn, it's almost like, fuck, he said his house is going to go up in smoke and his children are going to be destroyed. And then they do. And guess what? Nobody ever questioned Mr. Gianotto about any of that sort of thing. So, if the kids weren't found, were they kidnapped? Most likely point of the kidnapping would be between when Mary Ann fell asleep on the living room sofa and then Jenny Sodder waking up to the phone call at 12:30 a.m. And the kids, remember she walked through the living room, the kids were gone. If the kids were indeed kidnapped, it's highly unlikely the kidnappers would have been able to go into the house, so perhaps they had lured them out. The two older boys were already in bed asleep, so had they just been able to kind of whisper, luring the kids outside into a car that had been prepared for a getaway. One of the firemen who was on the scene that day said, "We looked through the ashes all day. I don't think they burned in there." In the same interview, he also said there was no smell of burning flesh, which he knew to expect when there was a house fire with victims. Then finally, the kids, going off on their own, getting lost, that seems unlikely. Maurice was 14, Martha 12. They were definitely old enough to have a grasp on the situation that if a fire was ongoing, they wouldn't just run away and get lost and never be found again. That doesn't really make any sense at all. I mean, there's so many different controversies in this case. We got that neighborhood dickhead, Lonnie, who tried to rob the house while the fire was ongoing. There was a ladder that was suspiciously moved shortly before the fire. The fire chief, being the most suspicious motherfucker who ever lived, he said he knew about the fire before anybody had told him about the fire. And he didn't have any interest in putting out the fire. It's just so strange. Apparently there was a dark car seen in the area on multiple occasions. These are things like locals in the area noticed and talked about, but none of these incidents or instances have any answers. Multiple sightings of the children were made after the fire. The majority of them were mistaken, but well-intentioned, or sometimes intentionally misleading. None of the sightings bore much value, and any leads were dead ends. Except one. One did stand out. This was from a woman named Ida Crutchfield. She was manning the reception at a hotel in Alderson, some 50 miles southwest from Fayetteville, and she gave a statement about Italian-speaking adults with 4 worried-looking children in their tow about a week after the fire. Now, Mrs. Crutchfield had no prior knowledge of the fire at the time of encountering these peculiar guests, and contacted the tip line about this information after a reward poster was posted in 1952. She was treated with hostility when she tried to speak to the children. The men the kids were with spoke in Italian with each other and stayed the night in a large family room. There was a lot of Italians in this area at the time. The descriptions and the estimated ages, they do match the Sodder children. But she also said there was only 4 kids when 5 were missing. From her description, it seems like the oldest kid was the one who was missing, Maurice, who would have been 14. As the oldest, maybe he would have been the hardest to control, and so he was killed before he could cause trouble. Were the kids then taken to a location where they themselves were killed, or maybe moved abroad, maybe back to Italy? We don't know. And then the question arises, if the kids were not killed, but moved, maybe separated and adopted into families, why didn't they later come forward as adults? The answer may be simply fear of retaliation. They were taken as revenge. Their house burned down, and officials supposedly paid off to make this a whole conspiracy. Was this all done as part of a mafia ploy? Who knows? Maybe they were taken abroad and told that their whole family was dead, so they would have no reason to come forward. The only piece of credible evidence any of the kids were still alive occurred in 1967. The Sodders, they received a letter addressed to Jenny. It was postmarked Central City, Kentucky. Inside was a photo of a man who looked extremely like Louis, who was 9 years old at the time of the fire. He would have been in his early 30s by then. On the back was written, Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Little boys, A90132 or 35. What that means, who the fuck knows? The family, they hired a private investigator to track down the photo's origin, but he just disappeared. He never got back to the family. In 1953, a billboard was built on site, in a position visible from Route 21, which is State Route 16 today. The billboard stood on that spot for 36 years, going through 2 refurbishments, and almost became like a tourist attraction to visit for people passing through this area of West Virginia. The billboard boasted a reward of $5,000, which was later raised to $10,000. And now George Sodder, he never gave up. He wrote to governors, attorneys, even J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI at the time. Every single president got a letter from the Sodders too, but it's unknown if any of them ever responded. The FBI's stance was that their jurisdiction didn't extend to matters of local authorities, and the only way they could put their investigative spoon into the mix was if the Fayetteville police asked them to. Did they ask them to? I don't think so. In addition to erecting billboards and making the most of the services of their local post office, sending out letters to anybody who would listen, George and Jenny hired an army of PIs to search for the truth about what really happened to their kids. They definitely met grifters and genuine people who wanted to help. Some people who just charged the money and then disappeared. Other people who just came up with dead ends. George Sodder, he never gave up hope and continued to follow leads up until his death. He traveled across the United States to track down possible sightings. He died a heartbroken man just 2 years after the Louis photograph arrived in the mail on August 16, 1969, at the age of 73. And there you have it. Sometimes, we don't have any answers. It's just sort of fucking frustrating, to be honest with you. Questions, nothing to answer them with. We don't really know much for sure about this case. That's the legacy, I guess, of corrupt officials and a botched investigation from the very start. And when it happened so long ago in 1945, Lord knows. I mean, with the people involved, victims, perpetrators, witnesses, all probably dead by now, the only way we may get some answer eventually is if a descendant of a surviving missing Sodder child is identified through DNA. Which I guess could be possible with all the genealogy kind of stuff we got going on these days. Sylvia, the youngest surviving Sodder child, who was just 3 at the time of the fire, she died in 2021 at the age of 79. She went on to marry a man she met in college and have 2 children as well as grandchildren. According to her obituary, she was a master of both Italian and American home cooking and had an exceptional sense of humor and an infectious laugh. The obituary also mentions Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty as siblings unable to be located. To end on a quote from Sylvia, who, never ever knew what happened to her brothers and sisters, she said, "I would love to know what happened. I know they could not have been in the fire. It's like you coming to an end of the story, and there is no end." And I think that pretty well encapsulates the case of the Sodder children. Folks, thank you so much for listening to this old episode of the TCP, the That Chapter podcast. Means a lot to moi that you're listening, folks. Hope you enjoyed this whole episode. And the next one will be up, I guess, sort of like when it's up. But I hope you look forward to it, and I hope you enjoy it. And kisses. Love you. Bye-bye. All right. Thank you, guys. Talk to you soon. Bye. Peculiarly